On January 19th, 1987, a 30-year-old named Tina Howard died of a heart attack. Her parents, Ben and Jean Williams, believed that her life was actually ripped away by some mysterious cosmic force that was enacting vengeance on Jean for desecrating a grave. In 1731, in Edison, New Jersey, a lady named Mary Moore was convicted of witchcraft and she was put to death. She was buried at the Piscataway Town burial ground. Legend has it that two boys later stole her headstone and then died shortly thereafter. People say that if visitors walk around her grave 3 times and then spit, her ghost will appear. About 2.5 hours north of Edison in New Haven, Connecticut, a seemingly healthy middle-aged woman, interestingly also named Mary, a lady named Mary E. Hart, suddenly and mysteriously fell over dead on October 15, 1872, at exactly midnight.
She just drops to the floor.
To the floor.
The family buried her at Evergreen Cemetery, but her ordeal was far from over. Shortly after the burial, her aunt had a terrible nightmare. In the nightmare, Mary was screaming and fighting for her life. Eventually, the aunt convinced the family to exhume the coffin.
They found Mary's nails bloodied from scratching, and a petrified look on her face.
They had buried Mary, not realizing that she wasn't yet dead. Ever since then, people say that her gravesite is cursed, and there's been all sorts of strange and bizarre reports that seemingly back up that idea. Case in point, the New Haven Register shares the story of how the cemetery manager, Del Fiore, got a phone call late one night notifying him that there was an alarm going off in one of the buildings at the cemetery.
It was one of those nights where it was icy snow, but the temperature was rising, you know. It was kind of melting and stuff was falling, and there were these little ice patches.
When Fiore arrived at the cemetery, he immediately noticed 2 things.
First, it was dark as hell. Second, there was no one there. No policeman, no nothing.
So Fiore decided to go home, but interestingly, when he shifted into drive and he pressed on the accelerator, the car refused to move. At first, he thought that maybe he was slipping on the ice, but later he said that that's not what it felt like.
It felt like my car was being held back.
As Fiore looked down at his car radio, he noticed the clock change from 11:59 to midnight. When he came into work the next morning, he found that there had been no record of any alarms going off in any of the buildings at the cemetery. Fiore believes that his experience is directly related to the cemetery being cursed due to the early entombment of Mary Hart. And we all know the legend of King Tut's tomb. On November 4th, 1922, Howard Carter discovered the ancient Egyptian tomb of the boy king, Tutankhamun. Between the burial chamber and the treasury stood the representation of the god Anubis, with a warning not to disturb the grave. Well, we all know that the warning was ignored and the grave was disturbed, and history reports a slew of strange and tragic events as a result, starting with the wealthy financier Lord Carnarvon, who funded the dig. In April of 1923, just a few months after the tomb was discovered, he was bitten by a mosquito while shaving and died. Supposedly, as he lay in his deathbed in Cairo, the lights of the city flickered on and off, and then went out completely. And oddly, at the very moment that he died, his dog Susie, who was back in England, sat up, howled, and then also died. And that was just the beginning. Some people believe that just about everyone who has ever had anything to do with that dig had to deal with tragedy in one way or another. In this video, we're going to consider the possibility that sometimes burial grounds might be cursed. And we'll do this by examining the story of the Williamses. Theirs is a dark and tragic tale that actually began with them picking out what should have been their dream home, but ended up with the death of their youngest daughter, Tina. We'll share how they first thought that maybe the house was haunted, but then discovered that bodies had been buried in the backyard. Over the years, many people have shared this account, and some people have added to the story in an attempt to make it spookier. Now it's difficult to know exactly what happened. So to clear this up, we're going to be sharing this story using the Williamses' own words from their own book, and we're going to be sticking to what they say happened. Now, like a lot of our reports, we know just how crazy this story is going to sound, but this is what the Williamses claimed happened. Then stick with us for our Fact or Fiction segment. There, I'm going to give my thoughts on this case. And then Amy is going to come on, and she's going to discuss ideas on why humans just might have begun burying their dead in the first place. So, this story begins with a huge oak tree. The Newport subdivision in Crosby, Texas. It was beautiful. At least Ben and Jean thought so, and the developers had just opened up Section 8. It was the summer of 1980, and the couple was looking at different lots, intending to buy one and then have their house built. One of their daughters lived in a different section of the subdivision, and they were moving away from Houston, and they thought that, well, now was a good time to move closer to their daughter. As they drove down the road, one of the lots stood out. They stopped the car and took a closer look.
The trees, Lord, how I love these trees, especially that oak. It makes me feel like I'm a girl again.
The oak tree was huge, and it was stunning, but there was something curious about it. Right there in the trunk, someone had carved 2 slashes and an arrow pointing downward toward the ground. Jean traced the carving with her finger.
I wonder what they mean.
Kids probably put them there decades ago.
Ben's words made sense, but then why did she feel such a wave of apprehension wash over her? Like a warning. Maybe they should choose a different lot. But just as quickly as that feeling came, it left, and the couple decided that no, this was the lot that they wanted. The builders started building immediately, and less than 6 months later, on Tuesday, October 14th, 1980, the house was ready to move into. Moving day was odd. It was like the opening scene of some dark horror film, really. As Ben and Jean were bringing boxes into the house, a number of crows gathered and began screeching at them. With every trip, the crows got closer and the screeches got louder. It got so bad that at one point, Jean looked up and told the crows to get over it, that they were neighbors now. And at that very moment, one of the crows made a mad dive directly at Jean. She ran inside and closed the door, narrowly escaping the crow's attack. And things only got stranger from there. During the first week, snakes and other animals boldly made their way up onto the porch, and the crows continued to gather. A few days after everything was moved in, Jean grabbed her shovel and headed into the backyard, intending to plant some flowers. As she stood halfway between the back fence and the house, she noticed several rectangularly shaped areas where the ground was sunken in. It reminded her of something, but at that moment, she couldn't quite place what it was. As she began to dig the hole for the rose bush, the crows began screeching again, and then one dove at her. Well, she shooed it away, but then another came, and then another. And before long, she found herself back inside of the house, watching through the window as dozens of crows descended onto the small hole that she had just dug and began kicking the dirt and filling the hole back in. From then on, it was as if a strange presence was in the house with them.
Jean felt, at times, that she was being watched, though by what or whom she couldn't say. She felt as if it, whatever it was, came from outside, from the backyard. It was almost as if she could feel a current of cold coming from the ground, direct to her.
These events were disconcerting, but one could explain them away as perhaps new house jitters. However, just a few months later, Ben would have an experience that couldn't be explained away by just new house jitters. Ben worked late, and he often got home after midnight. During the last week in January of 1981, he entered the house, and as he was going from the dining room into the den, he was puzzled by the odd quality of the darkness at the back two windows. Just for reference, that's where that giant oak tree stood, with that arrow and those two slashes. The darkness seemed as if it were somehow different from the darkness that usually came through those windows. And then suddenly, he realized why. The darkness was moving. It was coming through the windows toward him like patches of night that were etching themselves out of the background.
Shadowy forms, two of them, roughly man-sized but with no features, stopped a few feet from him.
At that moment, all of the air was sucked out of the room.
Ben gasped, staggered forward, reaching out, trying to push the shapes back.
A second later, the shadows were gone, and Ben could breathe again. The next day, he saw the doctor, and he was told that he had suffered a severe asthma attack. As the doctor was talking, Ben really wanted to tell him about the strange shadows, but he decided that he'd keep that part to himself.
Grown men didn't see ghosts, except in the movies, and Ben wasn't going to prove the exception.
Ben went home and life resumed, but over the next few months, strange things began to happen. The garage door would open and close all on its own. The toilets would flush when no one was in the bathrooms, and there would be this deep, eerie breathing sound all over the house. Most terrifyingly, those two dark shadows continually reappeared, and each time that they did, they would somehow suck all of the air out of Ben's lungs. This, of course, was always attributed to Ben having asthma attacks. And these events weren't just noticed by Ben and Jean either. Whenever visitors would come by, they'd feel that something was strange and off with the house as well.
I don't know what it is, but I feel more peculiar every time I come out here.
The Williamses had an extended family with 3 grown daughters. One spring day in 1982, while the youngest daughter, Tina, and a granddaughter, Carly, were visiting, a powerful storm rolled in. But interestingly, somehow, this storm only raged above Section 8. Once a person got out of that area of the subdivision, it was fluffy clouds and blue skies. The storm was so intense that the electricity in the house was out, and the 3 ladies, along with the family cat, Smokey, were all huddled together in Jean's bedroom. Then, suddenly, the front door slammed, and the girls fell silent. A moment later, they all heard footsteps on the tile, and the hairs on the back of Smokey's neck stood up, and everyone watched the bedroom door. The footsteps were getting louder. It was as if someone had come into the house, slammed the door, and was now walking down the hall toward the bedroom. The storm got angrier, and the footsteps got closer. Then Jean grabbed the .38 pistol that was kept near the bed, and she pointed it at the door.
Jean could feel the gun shaking in her hand. This was the first time she had heard footsteps in the house, and she was convinced she was about to encounter a burglar. There had, in fact, been a number of burglaries reported in the Newport area recently.
Jean tiptoed to the door and peeked out into the hall, but there was no one there. The strange thing was, the sound of the footsteps were still coming. And a second later, Jean said that she felt something evil pass through her.
Carly and Tina were still sitting in bed with their backs pressed to the wall and pure terror contorting their faces. The heavy, clumping footfalls stopped near the foot of the bed.
At that moment, the cat hissed violently, and then it leaped off of the bed as if it were attacking some invisible person.
Smokey arced through the air, and just at the highest point, he seemed to flash, as if some sort of electrical spark issued from him. He passed right over where the footsteps had last been heard. Then he dropped to the floor and seemed dazed. He walked, staggered a little, past Jean and into the corridor.
Shortly after this, the storm cleared up, and the feeling that there was a presence in the room dissipated. Over the years, however, these strange events continued to happen, and before long, the Williams found out that it wasn't just happening to them. Many of their neighbors in Section 8 were also having terrifying experiences of their own. And then one day, a neighbor decided that he was going to put a pool in his backyard. In mid-September of 1983, another family who had moved into Section 8 in the last year, the Haneys, decided that they were going to put a pool in their backyard. But just before the contractors broke ground, they received a knock at the door.
I see you're going to put a swimming pool back there.
An elderly black man stood on the porch.
Well, before you do, there's something you should know about your backyard. There are people buried back there, and if you let me through, I'll show you where.
Well, this sounded outlandish. Bodies buried in the backyard? Nevertheless, the man seemed convincing, so Mr. Haney led him around to the backyard.
There's a grave site right here.
The old man pointed to the ground.
Blacks have been buried in this neighborhood.
Mr. Haney didn't know what to believe, but he also didn't want to take any chances either, so he changed his swimming pool project to an investigative digging project, and sure enough, he found 2 bodies right where the old man said they would be. Shortly after this, everyone else in Section 8 learned the news, and then for the Williamses, it clicked. All of those sinkholes all over their yard, well, they had to be graves. The Williams' house was basically sitting on top of a small cemetery. This was about as much as they could take, and they put the house up for sale. But it was already too late. The word had gotten out, and no one wanted to buy a house in Section 8. To make matters worse, one night while Ben was balancing the checkbook, one of those horrible storms rolled in, and from where Ben was sitting, he could see that oak tree and the 2 slash marks in it with that arrow pointing toward the ground. The strange thing was this: each time that the lightning struck, the arrow would glow. Well, Ben and Jean just knew that there were bodies buried beneath that tree. Well, after a little investigating, they found the original owners of the property and others who had lived in the area decades earlier. One of them was a man named Will Freeman, and he confirmed that back in the Depression, hundreds of poor black servants and ex-slaves had been carelessly and haphazardly buried all over the area that was now known as Section 8.
In his 90s and blind, Will described the burials. He said it wasn't ideal burial ground, as there were many trees and rocks. The land was uneven and there were bogs. They'd usually choose higher ground. Those were the most sought-after spots. He related how he had buried, among others, 2 of his own sisters side by side under a small oak.
Ben and Jean took this information to the developers, the Purcell Company, and they demanded a buyout. But the Purcell Company refused, saying that, well, there wasn't really any proof that there were bodies buried in that backyard. This infuriated Jean, as she decided she was going to get proof. She bought a shovel. Just before Jean began digging below that oak tree, she learned that deliberately disturbing a grave was a Class A misdemeanor, so she hesitated. And while she was trying to figure out the law, those shadowy figures entered the house again. By this time, Carly, their granddaughter, was living with them, and these shadows attacked her in her sleep. Jean and Ben rushed into her room, and it was unreal. The book describes this moment as terrifying. They definitely felt the presence of evil, and somehow it became physical. Some invisible force knocked the couple to the ground. Jean had an out-of-body experience. It was like something out of a horror movie. The couple later said that they believed that their faith foiled the attack. After this, misdemeanor or no misdemeanor, nothing was going to stop Jean from digging up those bodies.
I don't care what happens now. I'm going to dig. I'm going to dig up those bodies and show the lawyers, the title company, the developer, and the whole bloody world that we are living on a cemetery.
Jean grabbed the shovel and began digging beneath the oak tree. She found that the soil was hard with rocks and roots in the way, but her resolve was strong, and she dug all that afternoon. And then, without skipping a beat, she started in again in the morning. Strangely, however, this time as she dug, a red liquid started dripping from the carvings in the tree. And then a shooting pain entered her shoulder, and an overwhelming feeling of doom saturated her. After a bit, she began to feel ill. Something did not want her to dig. Well, she stopped and looked at the hole.
Tomorrow. I'll get them tomorrow.
A little while later, the doorbell rang. Their youngest daughter, Tina, came to visit. By this time, the entire family knew that Jean was obsessed with the idea that there were graves all over her yard. But when Tina saw the hole, she gasped. And according to a statement made by their granddaughter, Carly, later, Tina volunteered to continue digging while her mother was ill. So she picked up the shovel and started digging. But almost immediately, Tina too fell ill. It was so bad that she had to stop digging and lay down on the couch. And as she lay there, her eyes glossed over.
Tina looked at all of them, but she no longer seemed to see anyone. "I love you," she said. And then she began to lose consciousness.
Although the family called the ambulance right away, strangely, it took much longer than it should have to get there.
Tina was unconscious when the ambulance arrived. It had gotten lost on the way to the house, and even more incredibly, it got lost again on the way from the house to the hospital. This cost precious time. For all practical purposes, she was dead on arrival, though it was not until 3 agonizing days later that the family agreed to withdraw the life support systems.
Ben believed that some cosmic evil force deliberately confused the ambulance driver coming and going, ensuring that their daughter would die. When Ben and Jean came home from the hospital, neither one of them bothered with that hole in the backyard. They just packed, got in the car, and left.
When Ben and Jean left Section 8, 7 of the 8 original homes there had been abandoned, and the 8th, the Haneys, was about to be. Like so many of the others, the Williamses simply stopped making payments after they left, and their home was soon foreclosed upon.
So, what are we to make of this report? Well, most of the world would say that the Williamses couldn't possibly have experienced what they claimed, that they had just let their superstitions run rampant. About that, Jean said this.
If we'd only got out sooner, that's the terrible irony. If we'd been what many people would interpret as weaker or more superstitious, whatever, we certainly would have gotten out a lot sooner. But our own skepticism, our grip on what people call sanity, kept us in there fighting, resisting, until the thing we were up against hit us so hard, we could only do one thing: get out.
It's also interesting to note that these experiences weren't just confined to the Williamses. Nearly every one of the original homebuyers in Section 8 went through their own terrifying nightmare. Many skeptics today, however, point to the fact that the homeowners who now live in Section 8 say that there's nothing supernatural about their homes. And as far as we know, most of the bodies were never exhumed and are still buried beneath Section 8. Amy looked into possible reasons that people began burying their dead in the first place. So I'm excited a little bit. You looked into burials and where it all started?
Right. So when I first looked into burials, I immediately thought of the ancient Egyptians, right? They gave us so much information about what they believed, right?
Right, yeah.
I mean, from burying their dead with like their organs in canopic jars, and then all the hieroglyphics about what they believed in the afterlife.
Right.
Well, so I thought this will be easy. I'll find what was the very first, oh my gosh, rabbit hole again. So I started looking into this case in the 50s. I believe his name was Ralph Selecki. He was an anthropologist, and his team discovered these Neanderthal bones, right?
Yeah.
I think, 40-some thousand years ago is when they think these bones were buried.
Right.
Crazy. It's hard for me to fathom. Well, anyhow, he surmised that because there was pollen around where these bones were found, that they put flowers or, some sort of, plants and flowers.
They planted flowers.
Right. Around the graves. Well, this became notoriously known as the collapse of the flower burial hypothesis. It was rodents.
Oh.
They found the burrowing patterns of rodents that actually brought the deposits of pollen to that site. Since that time, anthropologists, scientists, and the like have been very, very hesitant to ascribe any sort of meaning to items in the areas where they find bones. Right? But I did find two interesting cases. They're both cave burials. I think one is in South Africa. One, I forget the location now, of course, maybe India. But these bones are buried, if you want to call it buried, but very deep within these cave systems, right?
Yeah.
And what they found was that the bones are very hard to get to, and they're also located in places where these people came back often, right? So they would live in this cave system for a while, then probably because of weather or vegetation, whatever, move to another cave system, whatever. But this anthropologist, Mary Steiner, surmises that they came back to where maybe their ancestors, whatever, were buried, as some sort of connection between the living and the dead.
Yeah.
And I thought that was very interesting, right? So when you think about it, you just find bones. There weren't things, like we find in other burial sites with maybe necklaces or tools or whatnot. When there's just bones, she said, if you just look at the evidence that they're buried kind of under where these people lived at times.
Wow.
Yeah. It says something about what they possibly believed. So I found that interesting.
What was that? So they believed that...
Right. That they had some connection to the living and the dead. They somehow possibly wanted to keep the memory alive by continuing to come back to those same locations.
Yeah.
But like I said, because of that collapse of the flower hypothesis, no scientists really, I don't want to say no, but there are very few scientists willing to go out on a limb and say, well, we found beads here, so that means that these people believed X, Y, and Z.
What we need is a time machine.
Yeah.
And then we can go back in time and we can look at all those things.
Right.
So I have a theory,
yeah.
and it's probably wrong, but I think that thousands of years ago, back in the Stone Age, when people died, you had to take care of it. It made an awful odor.
Yeah, and probably brought
so you cover it up with dirt, and it takes the odor away.
Yeah. Maybe, and maybe, what we say, oh, if they put flowers on the grave, how sweet. Maybe it's because it smelled
the odor.
bad.
Yeah, maybe. So I got to ask you, like I always do then, this report with the Williamses, there's a lot of people involved, right? So
a lot.
So if I remember right, your research showed that by the time the Williamses moved out, 7 other families had, or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And so they had their own stories. The Williamses wrote a book.
Right.
But everybody else had challenges too.
Yes.
So I got to ask you, do you think there's anything to it? Or here's my thought. You're living on, you find out that you're living in an area where bodies have been buried. And the developers didn't care about that, like poltergeist or whatever, right?
Right.
And then that gets in your head. And you start thinking, oh my God, then every creak that you hear is one of the bodies coming back out of the grave. And your anxiety always is like, oh my God, there's a body underneath the oak tree. And then you just make things up.
Right.
What do you think?
I don't. So if they had moved in and pretty quickly found out that there were bodies. I would say, yeah, that makes total sense, right? They're weirded out. Or some people might argue they were trying to get out of that purchase. But they lived there for years. I mean, they talked about these neighbors, Audrey, I forget her husband's name. They lived there for a while before they found out.
Yeah.
Right, that there were any bodies. Same thing with the Haneys. So I feel like
that is freaky, right? So a lot of so spooky stuff is happening to the Williamses, to other families before they find out.
Absolutely.
That they're living above bodies, all these different homes. That's spooky.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's why I think there was, something. And Ben and Jean Williams, I mean, this was their dream. They were going to retire here. If you look at images of the neighborhood, like there's golf courses, a swimming pool, like it's just the perfect idyllic place.
Yeah.
And I find it very interesting that this last section that they opened, that the Williamsons were like, perfect, we want to live here. Years later, they find there are bodies buried there. For 100% sure, there were bodies buried in that section.
Yeah.
How many, we don't know.
Yeah.
And one of the most interesting things I found about this when I was reading the book and looking through a bunch of material is when Will Freeman said, well, I drew an arrow on a tree,
that oak tree,
to signify where I buried my sisters.
His 2 sisters.
My heart just was like, oh my,
Yeah.
So that was very, very interesting.
So Tina, right? She dies.
Yes, and others in the family.
Yeah, we didn't put that in. I didn't have a lot of time.
Right.
So there were 6 or 7 other people that died, right? So they would come over, they would visit the home and make remarks about what's going on.
Yeah, like this is a weird place. I get a weird feeling.
Jean would be like, I'm going to get to the bottom of this. And the more she tried to push forward, the sicker her family got. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I mean, her father, I believe, died of cancer. Ben's mother died. Jean's brother died. And this was all after visiting the house for a time. So
that's freaky. So you believe that there's something to it?
I really believe there's something to what happened there in Section 8.
All right. Well, thank you again.
You're welcome.
Haunted or not, I can't imagine living in a house that had been built over the top of a graveyard. Can you? This report reminds me of what happened to the Cranmer family. They purchased a house believing that it was their dream home, but it ultimately tore them apart. And in that story, just like with this one, desecrated souls were involved and put in the backyard. But unlike this story, the manner in which those souls were killed, it's shocking. We did a complete report on this. As a matter of fact, it was our 4th video on this channel. And I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Back then, we were super green. The report actually shows me in front of a CGI'd background, and is probably a little slow in some areas. But it is a fascinating story. And if you'd like to see it, it's here.
Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching. And if you have not checked out our 4th wall store yet, it's in every description. We've got some new products. Somebody asked for hats. So hats off to that person. We now have hats.
Check it out.